In the previous session, we saw that the sin of the people had been engraved on their heart, and it had become the natural tendency only towards evil, and they literally didn't know how to do good, is what the text says. And no amount of renovating the temple would renovate the issue deep within their heart. And now as we enter into this session, we leave behind the problem and move into the proposed solution according to the words of Jeremiah. And within this, we'll really open up the topic of the exile, which is, again, as we've been saying, this extremely significant event in the Old Testament. So you notice a direct shift as soon as we get to chapter 21. So chapters 2 to 20, there's no dates except for the one in chapter 3 where it says, in the days of Josiah. And now as we enter into chapter 21, there's dates and there's also people that they interact with, that share with Jeremiah their responses to his prophecies. They're pretty much always negative, but this is a new element in the story. And we'll see some more prose, like some more paragraphed writing in these sections from 21 all the way up until 29. Now, it does have its parallel section on the other side from chapter 34 all the way to 44. And what these have in common is they both begin, chapters 21 and chapter 34, within the crucial year of 588 BC. This is the year that Nebuchadnezzar marched one final time against Jerusalem to lay siege for 2 years, from 588 to 586 BC, the final 2 years of Jerusalem's story at this point. Then after that shared date formula, they move into an explanation of who is at fault in breaking the covenant. In chapters 21 up until 23, it's explaining that it's the kings and the false prophets that have led the people astray, and they're not able to keep the covenant. Then on the other side, chapters 34 and 36, it's the kings that are not able to keep covenant, and there's like 3 or 4 different narratives that display their fact that they cannot keep the covenants that they've made. And then finally, it's the solution, this accept judgment and surrender to Babylon, which we see in chapter 24 to 29, and then on the other side in chapters 37 to 44. So we're going to spend most of our time in this session from chapters 21 up until chapter 29. And so in chapter 21, it opens with the prophet, with the king Zedekiah sending one of his messengers to the prophet. He sends Pashur, a priest, to inquire of Jeremiah what is going to happen, because the king of Babylon has now just arrived on the scene. The boiling pot from the north that had been spoken about for years to come now has indeed come and encircled the city. This is actually the 3rd time in Judah's recent history that Nebuchadnezzar comes to invade. But this is the 3rd and final time. And so he sends word to Jeremiah and he asks him, notice in verse 2, it says, will the Lord deal with us according to all his wonderful deeds and will make him withdraw from us? Now, many years earlier, the Assyrian army surrounded Jerusalem, and Hezekiah goes to the prophet Isaiah and wonders a similar thing. And many commentators will say that when King Zedekiah sends word to Jeremiah with this question, he's hoping for an answer similar to the one Isaiah gave King Hezekiah. Yet, yes, the king won't even shoot an arrow, or a siege ramp won't even be laid against the city wall. That's what Isaiah told the king Hezekiah. But Jeremiah's answer could not be more different. In short, it's no. No, Zedekiah, now the Lord is not going to save you the same way he saved King Hezekiah under Isaiah. And why is that? Because now it's different, right? We saw from Manasseh onwards, the sin is so entrenched in the people, there's only one solution, and that solution is exile. And this is exactly what Jeremiah says. If you look at 21 verses 8 to 9, right? Before that, Jeremiah says, no, the city will be destroyed. The Lord will not cause Babylon to withdraw. And then Jeremiah says, and we'll read it because it's very important for the theme that builds in this section of Jeremiah. And to this people you shall say, thus says the Lord, behold, I set before you the way of life and the way of death. He who stays in the city shall die by the sword, by famine, and by pestilence. But he who goes out and surrenders to the Chaldeans, who are besieging you, shall live and shall have his life as a prize of war. Chaldeans there is a good who observation. It's another word for the Babylonians. And the words that Jeremiah is using, they're right out of Deuteronomy, the way of life or the way of death, and sword, famine, pestilence. That's all coming from the book of Deuteronomy. And so this is the first time we see this key theme in the book of Jeremiah. But it's followed up several times elsewhere. We see it in 27, verse 8 to 11. They're told to serve Nebuchadnezzar. In 27, verse 17, they're told to serve the king of Babylon, and if they do, they'll live. In chapter 38, verses 17, 18, and 21, Zedekiah is told 3 separate times to surrender to the Babylonians. And then lastly, 37, verses 13 to 14, it makes it clear that Jeremiah is known for this message. In that moment, he's going to leave the city, and he's arrested because he's accused of deserting to the Babylonians, because that was his message. It was surrender and you'll have your life. If you resist, you will be killed. Now, this is, again, not the message the people want to hear, right? According to Jeremiah, surrender means life and resistance or rebellion means death. This is the major theme that Jeremiah is going to embark on. And the response to this contradictory message is what we'll look at in the coming next 3 kings. Because this is not an easy message. Remember, he was hoping for a message similar to Isaiah, one of rescue, one of salvation. And it is still a message of rescue and salvation. It just looks different. To be saved and to be rescued by the Lord, you need to surrender. Okay? Let's go through it. So the final 3 kings of the nation of Judah is Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah. And we can see them all displayed from chapters 22 up until 23. Each one of them is equally guilty for leading the people astray. And the prophet goes through each one of them, condemning them. But each one of them also received instruction to surrender to Babylon. Okay? Jehoiakim, his isn't as direct as the words we see given to Zedekiah, but we read about it in chapter 25, verses 11 to 12. He's told that the exile will only be 70 years, meaning go into Babylon and you will be restored after 70 years. His response, though, is the same as Zedekiah. In 2 Kings 24, verse 1, it specifically says that Jehoiakim rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. And as a result, his punishment is death and dishonor. We see that in chapters 22, verse 19. Then let's skip to the last king, Zedekiah. We just read the words he heard from Jeremiah, and he's told that several times, and his response is also rebellion. 2 Kings 24, verse 20. He rebels against Babylon. And so, again, this is why it's so important to read the king's narrative in parallel to the prophet you're studying, because it doesn't specifically display the rebellion at all times, but when we compare it, we see the words that are given to the prophet and how the king disobeys that. But what about Jehoiachin? Jehoiachin, he came to the throne after Jehoiakim is killed in 598 BC, and he only reigns for a very, very short time. And he's taken into exile just a few months into his reign. And then we saw in the previous sessions, all the way at the end of the book of Jeremiah, he's freed. He's released in 561 BC. Now, and we also looked at now how that is paralleled or contrasted with Zedekiah, who dies in exile. Now, what was the cause for this change? Because we can even read in Jeremiah chapter 22, the curses that come against this man. In chapters 22 from 24 to 30, it's the king Jehoiachin, but Jeremiah calls him Coniah, one of his other names, and he's just as wicked, just as evil. But in chapters 20 in chapter 22 he's judged and condemned, but by the time we get to chapter 24 there's a much more positive picture of this king. Now what happened in between chapters 22 and chapters 24? Well, when you look in the book of Kings, you see that he surrenders. It says in 2 Kings 24 verse 12, Jehoiachin the king of Judah gave himself up to the king of Babylon. That's 2 Kings 24, verse 12. That word, gave himself up, is the Hebrew word yatzah, which means to surrender, to go out, to surrender exactly the word that Jeremiah told Zedekiah to do. Zedekiah did not listen. Jehoiakim did not listen. Jehoiachin was the only king that could listen. And as a result, Jehoiakim rebelled and was killed. Jehoiachin surrendered and was taken into exile, but in the end exalted and delivered. Whereas Zedekiah, the final king, he also rebelled, and the result was exile and death. And so this is a very interesting perspective on the exile. Jeremiah is telling people that the solution is exile, and he paints a positive perspective of the exile, that it's something you're meant to embrace. In the middle of chapter 23, we have one of the few key messianic prophecies about the coming King Jesus. 22 is a chapter about all these wicked kings that we just spoke about. 2 of them rebelled, and that's the end of their story. 1 repents. But in the middle of that, God promises one king that will come in the future, right? And it's a common prophetic name for this coming king, a branch from the family of David. And the description is that he will be a righteous branch and he'll rule righteously, unlike the previous kings. But I want to draw your attention to 23 verse 7 and 8. Because along with this coming king is also the end of the exile. But notice how it's described. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord. This is 23 verse 7. When they shall no longer say, as the Lord lives, who brought up the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives, who brought up and led the offspring of the house of Israel out of the north country and out of all the countries where he had driven them. Then they shall dwell in their own land. So notice the contrast in verse 8. The most incredible story of rescue and deliverance up until this point is the Exodus out of Egypt. But now God is saying, you're not going to say that. You're not even going to remember that in comparison to this new, if you will, second Exodus out of Babylon. At least in the context, that's what it implies. But we'll see as we move in towards the New Testament that the second Exodus promised here is from something much bigger than Babylon. Jeremiah says this in 23. He also says it in 16 verses 14 to 15. These are incredible passages to observe and understand that the people then begin to long for a second Exodus that will bring them out of their exile. Moving forward into chapters 24 and 29, this is where Jeremiah really paints clearly this positive perspective of the exile. Chapter 24 is a crucial vision that Jeremiah has that really helps us ground his understanding of the exile. And notice the year. In 24 verse 1 is when he sees this vision. Okay? And it's after Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had taken into exile from Jerusalem Jeconiah. That's Jehoiachin, the king we just spoke about, who had surrendered. So this is around 597 BC, and Jeremiah has just witnessed a king surrendering to Babylon and going into exile with a large group of the population. And now God shares with him this vision. This is why observing time is very important, because Jeremiah and the others around would have questions. Why did he surrender? What's God doing in this situation? So Jeremiah has shown a vision, and like all of the visions in Jeremiah, first you see the vision and then you read the explanation. So Jeremiah sees the house of the Lord. Okay, it's important to observe the location in verse 1. And in front of the house of the Lord, there's 2 baskets. One has ripe figs and one has vile, gross figs. Okay? Very bad figs is what it says. And then God asks Jeremiah, what do you see? Like he did in chapter 1. And he says, good figs, very good, and bad figs, very bad. Then the Lord explains from verses 4 to 7, who are the good figs? And then from verses 8 to 10, who are the bad figs? Now, you would assume that the bad figs are the ones that are thrown out, the ones that are taken out and chucked away, like the exiles thrown out of the land, like Jehoiachin who surrendered. They're now kind of thrown out. That's what the original audience of Jeremiah would anticipate. But God says, no, the good figs are the exiles, right? It says in verse 5, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, like these good figs, so I will regard the exiles from Judah, whom I have sent from this place into the land of the Chaldeans. And then notice the promise that's coming for them. It's the same promise from those governing verbs in 1 verse 10. I will set my eyes on them for good. I will bring them back to this land. I will build them. I will plant them. And then it says, as a hint of what's to come, in verse 7, a heart to know that I am the Lord. Remember, the problem is the condition of their heart. And so this is opposite of what Jeremiah's original hearers, the audience in the temples and in the temple and in the street would be anticipating. The people that just were taken off into exile who surrendered, they're not the bad figs. They're not chucked out. They're actually the good figs that God is going to restore one day. Now, who are the bad figs? The bad figs are the ones who remain in Jerusalem. Right? It says, thus says the Lord, like the bad figs that are so bad they cannot be eaten, so I will treat Zedekiah, the king of Judah, and his officials, the remnant of Jerusalem who remain in this land. And so it's opposite of what they think. Now, again, let's remember the location of where these figs are. Jeremiah sees 2 baskets right in front of the temple of the Lord. And so if you have 2 baskets of fruit on your doorstep, one is rotten and one is good, you're going to throw out the rotten ones. You're certainly not going to bring them into the house. And the good figs you'll bring into the house. And this is why it's important to observe where these baskets are in front of the temple of the Lord, because the ones going into exile seem like they're the ones going away from the presence of God. But actually, God's saying, you're the ones I'm bringing into the temple. You're the ones I'm bringing into the presence of God. Now, Ezekiel makes that abundantly clear, saying that God actually goes with his people into exile. He follows them there. But this is very different than what the people thought. And it's because God said, if you surrender, I'll be with you. Let's continue on. Chapter 25, we start to see that the key idea that the exile only will last 70 years. Okay? It says it in verse 25, verse 11 and verse 12. And this is again where the idea of this positive exile, it's not for forever, it's for a purpose. And this is also where Jeremiah really has to combat the false prophets. So in chapters 23, verse 16, it talks about the vain hopes that the false prophets are speaking. The vain hopes is that the exile will be short, just a matter of a few years. And Jehoiachin, the one who surrendered himself, he'll come back in just a matter of years. But Jeremiah is saying, no, it's actually going to last 70 years. We come back to this theme again in chapters 27 and 28. Now, chapters 27 and 28 are a very interesting moment in Israel's history. This is at the time of Zedekiah in 593 BC, so about 4 or 5 years after Jehoiachin has already surrendered himself and gone into exile. There's a moment where Babylon seems weak. There's internal rebellion, and they seem as though they're not the strongest world power that they used to be. And so what happens is Zedekiah gathers around the neighboring nations to come and meet in Jerusalem to plan a resistance against Babylon. You can see that in verse 3 of chapter 27. It says, send word to the king of Edom, the king of Moab, the king of the sons of Ammon, the king of Tyre, the king of Sidon, by the hand of the envoys who have come to Jerusalem to Zedekiah, king of Judah. Now they came there in this year to plan their rebellion, to plan their resistance. in total opposition to the words of God through Jeremiah, to surrender. And so Jeremiah is told to symbolically act out his prophecy, which again is a common theme in the prophets, especially in Jeremiah and most notably in Ezekiel. And he's meant to make yoke bars that you would, like animals would use to plow the field. And so he brings in these, he wears this yoke and tells the kings to submit to the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar. And there's a very interesting word that's used in verse 6. It says, "Now I had given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant." God's servant is Nebuchadnezzar. Again, that's this positive picture. It's not an accident that Nebuchadnezzar showed up. He's the servant of Yahweh. Now that comes up about a few times in the narrative. And again, he's saying, serve them and don't listen to the prophets. You see what the false prophets are saying later on, down in verse 16. "Thus I spoke to the priests and all the prophets, saying, Thus you shall say to the Lord, do not listen to the words of the prophets who are prophesying to you, saying, Behold, the vessel of the Lord will now shortly be brought back from Babylon." This is again an idea that the exile is like almost an accident, and God will shortenly set it right. Whereas Jeremiah says, no, it's going to be 70 years. And so that kind of concludes chapters 27 and 28. And moving into chapters 29, it's still in this same theme, okay? Because we see in 29 verse 10, Jeremiah again repeats himself that the exile will be 70 years. And notice at the end of this, it says in verse 28, "Your exile will be long. Build houses in them, plant gardens, and eat their produce." Now what's happening in Jeremiah chapter 29? Notice at the beginning it says, "These are the words of the letter." So chapter 29 is a letter, most of chapter 29 is a letter that Jeremiah wrote and sent to the exiles. Notice which exiles he's sending it to. In verse 2, "This was after the king Jeconiah, the one who surrendered, and the queen mother and eunuchs and officials of Judah and Jerusalem, the craftsmen and the metalworkers had departed from Jerusalem." This is actually the moment that the prophet Ezekiel also goes into exile. And it's incredible to compare the message of someone in exile through Ezekiel and the message of Jeremiah still in Jerusalem. And there's some important similarities we'll look at in the coming session. And so Jeremiah writes them a letter. And it's because they've been listening to these vain hopes, these vain false prophecies, also in exile, saying the exile will end soon, as if it was a mistake that God needs to correct. And so Jeremiah writes this letter to, in a sense, the good figs, right? Because chapter 24 said, these exiles that have gone, they're the good figs. And so Jeremiah writes this letter almost to offer encouragement to them, as they probably think they're the bad figs, the ones that have been thrown to the side. And notice what he says. You can divide it into kind of two sections. From verses 5 to 7, Jeremiah tells them what they're to do in the present. And then from verses 10 to 14, he talks about the future that will come as a result. And it's very good to observe, almost as a list, what actions he tells them to take in the present. He says, build houses. This is in beginning in verse 5. Build houses, plant gardens, take wives, have sons and daughters, have grandsons and granddaughters, seek the welfare of the city. And just before that last one, multiply and do not decrease. Now, if they're just kind of waiting around for the exile to end, they're not going to be building homes and planting gardens. They're not going to be seeking the welfare of the city, seeking the welfare of Babylon. They're going to be only interested on exiting as soon as possible. Why does he then tell them to build and plant? Well, it's one, to confront the false prophets that are saying it's a lie that you're going to come home in a short amount of time. You're going to be there for 70 years. But as well, it's because as soon as they're going to be set free, as soon as they're going to go home, the first thing they're going to do in Jerusalem is build houses and plant gardens. That's the first activity they're going to engage in. And so Jeremiah tells them to already anticipate that rescue by how they're presently living. Display that hope that God will in the long run save you by trusting Him and building and planting homes in your exile. It's remarkable to view the exile as this way. Now let's go a little bit deeper here, because when he tells them to multiply there and do not decrease, the end of verse 6, this is the same commission that God gave to Adam in the garden and Noah after the flood. Now, Adam and Noah are displays of a new beginning, right? The creation obviously is the beginning. Noah had a fresh start after the exile, and now God's telling them in their exile that you have an opportunity at a new beginning. Don't sit around and wait. God is with you in your exile. Then another kind of connection back to Eden is this word welfare in verse 7. Seek the welfare of the city, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Repeated 3 times. This is a key word. And this is the Hebrew word for shalom, which is typically translated peace, but it means the right ordering of everything. And that was the condition of the Garden of Eden. And so God is saying that even in your exile, you can have Eden-like conditions where you can be fruitful and multiply. And you can bring peace in your own life and peace into the city that you're in. Totally different than if they're thinking that was an accident. It was as if God was asleep and we ended up here for no reason. No, you surrendered there, and God promised, if you surrender and walk yourselves into exile, I will be with you and I will bless you. And you can anticipate that one full and final rescuing out of exile by living like it's already happened, even though you're in exile. Remarkable words. And so this was a letter that was already written to the original readers of all of Jeremiah, but this is a foretaste of what's to come. Again, when Jeremiah sends information to Babylon, chapters 29 and chapters 50 and 51, detailing the destruction of Babylon, they're always very hopeful because he wants to give hope to those that have gone into exile. Now, if we were to do some application for our lives today, in the New Testament, it does say that believers are somewhat in exile presently, that we're in a world that's not really our own and we're anticipating one to come. Now, as a believer, are we meant to just kind of sit around and wait out our 80-some years of life until we get to heaven and then one day to the new heavens and the new earth? No, this message from Jeremiah inspires and calls us forth to live in a way that anticipates how we will one day fully and finally live in the resurrection. The resurrection will be marked with peace and justice and goodness. Now we're meant to live in a way that displays that one day the world will be full of peace and justice and goodness. And so this is something we can meditate on. How are we living as we anticipate our full and final delivery? In what ways is God telling us to this anticipate this rebuilding? What can we restore in the moment? And so this is where this section ends. And then there's a drastic shift into chapter 30. Now the parallel to this, which begins in 34 onwards to 44, we're not going to spend too much time there. It's basically the narrative of the leading up until the destruction of Jerusalem, detailing the kings that are unable to keep a covenant, and then the judgment. But what's interesting to note, Jeremiah has been talking about the fall of Jerusalem prophetically for so long in the book. And then when it finally does happen, in chapter 39, Jeremiah only gives 10 verses to the destruction of Jerusalem. 39 verses 1 to 10. And he very quickly moves on to another topic. Now, in the book of Kings, it's given almost an entire chapter, 24 verses. And it's because Jeremiah's message isn't focusing on the judgment. It's to focus on what comes after the judgment. And notice the narrative that comes directly after the judgment. And this story is not in the book of Kings at all. From Jeremiah 39, 11 to 18, it's a story of liberation and rescue, right? Jeremiah is rescued and saved from the Babylonians. They release him, and they do so along with Ebed-Melech, a character that we haven't talked about, but he's one of the king's servants who saves Jeremiah and feeds Jeremiah while he's in one of his imprisonments. And so one author put it like this: the astonishing aspect of this account of the fall of Jerusalem is that the conquest of Jerusalem meant not simply destruction, annihilation, death, and deportation, but for a portion of the population, improved circumstances, and for certain individuals, even liberation. And the exiles reading this, they need to know that. The original readers of this book in exile need to know that after the fall of Jerusalem, that wasn't the end, that God immediately jumps into his restoration plan. Now, it will take some time, but that's at the heart of this twofold movement we've been talking about, from judgment to restoration. Now, we've covered a lot of ground in these 18 chapters. And as we looked in the previous situation, we explored the dire situation that Judah is in, that their heart has sin engraved on it. In this session, we explored the solution to that, and that's exile, where you surrender and give your life over to God. That's your act of repentance. And when they do that, that act of repentance is the only thing that's capable to get to the heart. And we'll see that in the coming session, the result of this surrender.